Welcome to the Chess Channel, the channel where you can learn loads. To date, we have produced 19 videos. Each and every single video, as you may have gathered, is different. In our last video, we looked at 3 isolated and very different puzzles. The one before that, looked at a Bobby Fischer video, and the time before that, we looked at a game from the very recent Chess Olympiad of 2022 that was hosted in Chennai, India. Today's video is one which caused too much controversy. Before we put things into context, have you ever heard the term or phrase more is less? This is often true in the engine world, when some pieces are there but do obstruct you from making any real progress. Needless to say, this often happens during human play. The game we shall be looking at today is one such game. So how could more be less? There are hundreds of cases we can use. In order to illustrate, we are going to look back at the 2019 World Chess Blitz Championship and specifically, one of the games between the rising star Alireza Firouzja and World Chess Champion Magnus Carlsen. Before we jump into this game, a word, if I may, on the FIDE Rules of Chess. Okay, maybe we will skip this part for the time being, but we would need to come back to this when time is right. Without a shadow of a doubt, there are many of us, and it doesn't matter who you are, who are not familiar with all the rules of the game. For example, Super Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, in an attempt to castle, he first picked up his rook and he was already in violation of the rules of the game. The legendary Garry Kasparov picked up his knight, he placed him back onto the same square and then went on to play something else. This too was in violation, but his opponent gave him the benefit of a doubt and let him play on. Other grandmasters tried to castle when they had already moved either the king or the rook at the side they intended to castle. This was and still is a clear violation of the chess rules. Have you ever read the FIDE Laws of Chess, and do you know how many pages it comprises? It has 14 articles and it contains 25 pages. If you never familiarized yourself with them, you would probably at some stage fall short all the rules, and this is where controversies and misunderstandings are bound to occur. Let's look at the World Blitz Championship game between Alireza Firouzja and Magnus Carlsen. Reza gained plenty of popularity right after he moved to France, after his home country banned him from competing in certain international events. Reza felt constricted. He then, for a short while, was playing chess under the FIDE flag, and then when France accepted his paperwork to reside in France, Reza is now playing for France. This also means he knocks off from the pedestal the highest-ranked player in France, this being of course Maxime himself. Alireza Firouzja is not only France's strongest player, but he is also the world's number 2. With this info in mind, and given that we note the details of the game in case you wish to research further, this is how this game got started. We saw 1 e4, Carlsen responds with the usual e5, and with knight f3 and knight c6, this game was either going to go into the Italian or Spanish. When Reza launched this response, I don't think anyone needs any refreshing on what we are seeing. When this attack on the bishop appeared, the bishop backed off. Magnus chooses for this avenue of play, and what you see here has all the marks of the modern Steinitz defense in the Spanish. When Reza castled, Magnus developed the bishop, and with Reza opening up a path for the bishop to be able to use the opening on b3 and c2. This move to c3 additionally prepares a possible central launch with d4. Magnus here opened up the kingside diagonal, and what he permits Reza to do is to go for the center. This is exactly what Reza played. Magnus in turn gets his bishop to occupy the diagonal, and no one is really rushing to make ends meet. It's a blitz game with neither player rushing to open up the board. Could this be the calm before the storm? This opening you see here has been played hundreds of thousands of times before, and this explains why blitz games normally follow typical opening lines. How do you approach this position and what is best to do? Should you chase after this knight? When the knight backs off to this outpost, these two bishops are facing each other. You can either take on d7 or opt for this knight move. Should these two bishops depart, how serious would this check be? It would not be all that much of a worry. You can either block it with the queen, or you can hunt after the queen in this way. In either way, however you choose to play it, what you see is very close to equality, and do not be surprised if you get an engine showing triple zeros. Returning to the original game, this knight on c6, if not attacked now, he would be attacked later. Reza might have been concerned about the likely consequences of the knight on f3 being pinned, and maybe for this very reason, he showed his hand. He blocked the access to g4 in this way, and with Magnus now developing his kingside knight, okay, he has an attack on e4, but most importantly, because Reza can cover, Magnus is looking to bringing in castles. In the likely case of the bishop on a4 coming under fire, Reza does not even wait until his bishop is threatened. He pulled him back into this outpost. Magnus in turn gets his king to safety. And via this rook repositioning, Magnus too copies over that move and brings his rook into e8. Knight d2 was played here. And from what we can see from how this game develops, whatever move you would expect, this structure is very similar to what we see happen with the Italian. Reza is very likely planning to bring this knight from d2 into the first, and then go on and jump him either into e3 or g3. We have seen both of these initiatives in other games, but it's all down to Magnus and how he chooses to move on. Magnus came up with this queen repositioning. Firouzja was not affected by this response. He still went on with a move he was looking to go for earlier. He indeed got the knight to return to the first, and what Magnus does here is to go for a rather strange yet awkward move. This is what he does, but was this a blunder or a very passive move? It could be both, but certainly it was one if not both. Magnus was concerned about the very location of his queen, but what was on his mind? Knight g3, as we assumed earlier, led to Magnus to reposition his bishop to the rim. And what is Magnus hoping to achieve, is to trade the bishops. It wasn't to be though, only because this decision rested with Reza. He jumped the knight into the fifth. What is the knight actually doing on g5, and why go for this move in particular? This is how the game continued. This knight U-turn looks like an excellent response. With the bishop returning to b3, Magnus knows exactly what he is doing. He blocked the bishop's access into the file by getting his knight to jump into this space. This looks in fact like a smashingly good initiative. What this move does, is to give plenty of thinking for Reza to do. This knight on e6 has a specific aim, a purpose if you like. Can you see what he does and how Magnus intends to use him? This is how Firouzja continued. It's an excellent way forward, but would queen f3 would have been any stronger? With h4 on the board, this move covers the knight, and Alireza has everything covered. Magnus decided for this choice of move, but what is the rook going to do here, and how is Carlsen going to get him to become active? Firouzja saw something in this position, and before he got things in motion, he first developed the bishop to be able to maintain his central control. Magnus, without any real delay, returns the bishop into the diagonal. And one move you do not get to see very often is the move Reza discovered. Can you try and figure out what he did and why this move looked so imperative? It's a cracking initiative. h5 appears to be handing over a full pawn, but are we able to see beyond this forward attack? If you take, there is an option between two moves. The first one if to get rid of this knight using the knight, and if you capture with the pawn just to be able to open this file where the queen is. This pawn on h5 can now be recouped. If the knights additionally come off, is there a way to overcome the disaster that is about to unfold? The only move to go for would be to get the queen to come out. If you don't want to swap the queens, you can easily back here off, and should you use the bishop to chase after her, queen h2 looks about the right move to go for. The king on g8 is defendable, but with two open files on the king side, this game could go in either direction. If Carlsen has a problem, his problem would be this bishop on b3. He is the mother of all problems, and Carlsen would not be able to shake him. What he can do is to advance this pawn, but if you do this, you would be opening up other doors. When this pawn comes off, this pawn on e5 is not only strong, but with the attack on the bishop, this bishop is powerless to do anything but retreat somewhere safe. If you place him here, then Reza would be able to sneak into this file. It's not the biggest of attacks because the rook is able to flee. Place him here, and if it's not a rook lift to the third, what does this alternate move to f4 do? c6, for example, in an attempt to keep Reza at bay, will be met undoubtedly by this rook lift. And should you answer in this way, yes, c4 is coming, but so be it. Just activate this rook, and should the bishop come under fire, after he repositions to safety, Magnus would seem busted. Rook h3 is coming and there is very little he can do. Returning to the actual game, when Magnus got confronted by this attacking initiative, he is clearly not happy with what he sees. His follow-up response shows this. Do you want to see this move? He returned the bishop into the diagonal. But as soon as this push to h5 took place, Magnus had seen absolutely nothing. It appears he was somewhat blocked. How do we know this? Is because of how he decided to move on. He just returned the bishop to the rim and was waiting for Reza to act. Reza opted for this queen repositioning. He is not willing to trade, but he will have no problem if Carlsen starts swapping. Does he? Not just yet. Magnus saw an opportunity here. What he did was to chase after this bishop. If you retreat, there would be a pawn at stake and Reza is most likely to lose him. And yet, when this position appeared, Reza throws everything into the mix. He went on to get rid of the knight, Magnus too gets rid of him, and now via this rook repositioning, any ideas what is best to do? Magnus took the bishop using his knight. This knight is hit on instantly, and with the queen being automatically exposed, as soon as Carlsen got her to move into the 7th. What we get to see here is that Magnus's relatively bad position has not got better. This is how good Magnus is. From 1 second, he is worse off and out of nowhere, he comes out of trouble and he is the one who creates the threats. What happened from this point on is very normal. This pawn on the 6th came off, and of course Magnus goes on to recoup this pawn. Queen d2 led to this pawn to come off, and with Reza capturing in this way, Carlsen tries to make some progress, but his method is not that transparent. He opted for this king move. Why did he go for this move and what are his motives? When Reza lifted his rook to the 3rd, Magnus and anyone else watching or following this game pretty much know what is to follow. So how Magnus responded here was quite expected. He challenged this rook. Reza in turn gets his other rook into the picture, and of course it takes very little fantasy and imagination to figure out what continued. The rooks first were traded. And with Magnus getting his other rook to step in, this is how Reza reacts. It looks like a brilliant move, but in this type of game, do not expect to get anywhere fast. Magnus calculated the what-ifs of this variation and does allow Reza the opportunity to come in with a discovery. This is what he does. But since Reza no d5 would not get him very far, he swapped or tried to swap his tactics. He thought his knight was otherwise lame, and with him not being able to do much from where he was parked, this is what he does. e5 led to the rook to depart, but how is best to have this rook recouped? If you take with the queen, once you allow this pawn to be removed, should he come off? It's all about this takes with a check. King h7 gets the king easily away from any real trouble, but it's what follows that might be worrying. Discover this queen initiative, and the next moves are forced. In order to save catastrophe, this would be the only response available. If the queens do come off, Reza's pawn surplus would not mean much. It's a double pawn, and with what you see here it is highly unlikely anyone can win, unless we get to experience a major blunder. So for this very reason, Magnus never allowed a pawn to drop. He took the pawn with the king. Reza saw a mate potential in just one move, and with him taking the chance, Magnus nullifies this attempt by bringing in his own queen. He could have tried queen g7, but this is what he attempts instead. If you do come in with a check, after the king finds the 7th, this potential check is easily met by this move, and with the queens actually forced off, Magnus would be in a much better position than otherwise the case. If we do return to this position, Reza opted for plan number 2. He got rid of this pawn. Magnus is forced to capture with the queen, because if you do this with the pawn, You will get crucified in this way and the game automatically ends here. Being in a way forced to remove this pawn with the pawn, Reza found himself to be in the driving seat. He launched this check, and with this automatic type of cover, Firouzja was beginning to lick his lips. He can either take with a check or he can go on to remove this pawn from the 7th. When he opted for the latter option, Reza was onto this bishop. Magnus has a problem here. Not only his bishop is under attack, but this pawn is under fire too. For the time being, the queen does cover the pawn, but at same stage he would need to find a way to activate his queen. With him going for this move, Firouzja was not amused. He rolled in with this check. Magnus runs with his king to the only legal square possible. But this move also had further consequences. Why can't Reza have this pawn taken with an incoming check? With Reza doing just this, Magnus knew if he wants to do something, he would need to do much better than what he did in the last 5 moves. He can either go for king d7, or bring in the queen to block this check. Carlsen went for option number 2, and Reza very fast has to decide on how to make progress. Does he come in with a check from a7 or does he trade the queens? With the 2-pawn surplus, Reza trades, and the idea for this trade was to be able to chase after this pawn with the bishop. If you go for g5, both knight g3 works, and additionally knight d2 is equally very attractive. Knight g3, for example, to get in with a nasty fork will lead to either a king move, a bishop move away from h7, or a bishop move into d7 to stop the forking. If you want to solve the problem with the double pawn, you may still come in with this fork, and when these 2 minor pieces depart, there are many ways to solve the problem in the center. If you want to stop e4, you can occupy it yourself. If you do, go for this avenue of play, and the opposite color bishops to increase the likelihood of a draw, but this would not mean we do have a draw. This is one combination of thousands to consider. What we saw unfold in this game was totally the opposite. Returning to the game, Magnus traded the bishop to the knight. And what this move did was for Magnus to be allowed to get rid of this pawn from the 3rd. And yet against all odds, this is not how Magnus continues. He advanced this pawn. Reza here activates his king. And with Magnus returning his bishop to the back rank, Reza goes for a consecutive king move. When the bishop came under fire, Reza backs him off, and because of this reciprocal attack on the pawn, Carlsen advances this pawn to a dark square. The pawn is safe from the likes of the bishop, but what is going to happen when these 2 pawns on the queenside start to roll? King e2 led to Magnus to also go for a king move. And with Reza blocking Magnus's king in this way, this is how Carlsen plays it. Why would you think he commits to something like this? Well, strictly speaking, with every single pawn on black squares, and with this pawn on e5 covered by the king, Magnus Carlsen knows the only way for Reza to make progress is to make a break on the queenside. And because b4 is forthcoming and this is near certain, this bishop move to e7 would be just in time to either get the king moving back to c7, or Carlsen is looking to return the bishop to the back rank in order to be able to deal with Reza's break on the queenside. Reza has come a very long way and is very capable of working out what looks to be a relatively uncomplicated endgame. He got his king to return to the 3rd. Magnus in turn does return the bishop to the back rank. And with Reza gaining access into the outpost with the king, the world champion is in fact numb. He repeated the move with this bishop, but for how long is he going to hold this defense? Bishop e7 led to the king to gain space up the board. And you know what is said about the power of the king. He is a formidable piece. He counts for a single point, but his true value is infinity. We often hear the queen is the most valuable piece on the chessboard. Well, this is absolutely nonsense, and let's explain why. You can still play a game without the queen, but this would not be possible if you didn't have a king. The king is the only piece that cannot be captured. The only thing that can happen to him is to get checkmated, but you can never remove any king from any board. In fact, have you ever tried online on a digital board to try any position without the king being present? You will not be able to set anything up without the king's presence. Once we got this little detail out of the way, Magnus bounced his bishop back to the last rank, and without any real delay, right after this push to the fourth, once again Magnus Carlsen is a sitting duck. He went for yet another repeat and is just waiting for the inevitable. A3, led to another repeat. Reza launches fourth with this pawn, and now with another two pawns coming off. The ending was both a matter of time and moves. Bishop e7, led to this advancement. Magnus repeats for the time. And with Reza getting his king to find the sixth, Magnus finds the time to chase after this pawn. Who would not expect this bishop move to c6? It's unbelievable how Reza just missed it. He in fact blunders in this way, but he is still very hopeful. Even if you blunder, you will easily get there, and this might explain why Reza chose for this king move. When the pawn came off, this pawn also disappeared. Carlsen is a true master in all aspects of the game, but even a master is not omnipotent. He got the king to get closer into the action, but he was confronted by this response. One thing you don't see Magnus do is to resign. Bishop a5 was followed by this pawn advancement, and something was about to happen fast. Why does Carlsen go for this bishop move to a5? This was the reason why. He wants all these pawns, but can he get to them all? With Reza pushing on, Magnus returned the bishop here just to be able to stop Reza's might. King f5, and now king b6, which is actually the most horrible move, and Reza here is not even interested in the likes of this pawn on g5. What he did was to push on with this pawn. Carlsen returns his king to the seventh, and all he cares for now is to find a way to stop anything from promoting. Even though Reza could technically remove this pawn from the fifth, he strictly avoids the dark squares. He went for this move. Magnus here returns his king to the back rank, and as soon as Reza saw this move, only now he chooses to get rid of this pawn. Needless to say, all these moves are being blitzed out. King e7, king h5, bishop d2, and g5, and Carlsen knew he was toast. Was he possibly playing on time? Reza was down to his last few seconds in single figures, and Magnus had just about 18 seconds remaining. Bishop f4 led to this bishop to come under fire. And with Magnus forwarding this bishop to the second, the game ended because Firouzja's time came down to 0. So basically he ran out of time, but it was what to follow that led to all the controversy. A lot of people were watching this game live, and yet very few knew what happened. Reza was one of the few who had no idea actually how this game ended and who won. Can you tell from what we see here who actually won and who lost and why? Alex Grishuk, who was also watching the game, stepped in to provide his opinion, and there was some discussion whether this game was actually a draw. It is a draw even if you do get flagged, but there is one condition for this to happen. If you cannot win, then this must be a draw, correct? Absolutely correct, but this is the very reason why we need to be familiar with the FIDE Laws of Chess. With the arbiter, who was not very sure what to do, after plenty of discussion amongst the crowds, everything came down to the chief arbiter. He was the one who had to be summoned to solve the problem. The Greek arbiter first explained his decision to Magnus and then to Alireza. You might be surprised to hear what he said to both players. And this is what he used. So far there is a way to checkmate Reza's king, in any way possible, then this game cannot be declared a draw but a win for Carlsen. In the meantime, is there a way, any way Magnus can checkmate Reza's king with only the bishop? Reza was clearly not happy with the final decision, even though he began to take it, by cracking a smile. On his way out of the hall, he did throw away his bottle of water in great disbelief. So what had upset him so much? It's the way the checkmate can be used to demonstrate. It does not have to be neither a reasonable nor a realistic approach. What we can use is to just demonstrate how a checkmate can be applied, and this is what was used to argue the case. To put things into perspective, Alireza returned to the main hall and confronted the chief arbiter, demanding an explanation about his final decision to allocate Magnus Carlsen the full point. The chief arbiter Takis Nikolopoulos advised young Reza and told him his decision was based on the correct interpretation of the FIDE Laws of Chess. He told him there is a rule, but Reza in a big smile demanded to see this rule. Despite this decision, Reza went on to submit an appeal on an entirely different ground. He accepted the arbiter's explanation but claimed Carlsen was shouting things in Norwegian during the game and that distracted him. When the cameras were checked, the arbiters could not see Magnus doing any talking and Reza's appeal was rejected. So how on earth does this game end in favor of Magnus Carlsen? Are we able to find any way possible to show a checkmate, however unlikely and realistic this may look? If you have this very exact same position and you were playing this game online, or even at home on a personal computer, there is no program in the world that is not going to reward you with half a point. In the meantime, this is what was demonstrated, and this is, however, impossible this end position may look. And just before we show, can you work out an ending where black is able to checkmate? There are few ways to do this. At this point, it might be wise to spend some time trying to figure out how a checkmate can be accomplished using, of course, always legal moves. If you can find any one of these ways, then the game is winnable. If there is no way you can checkmate, the game would draw. Check this out very carefully. King f5, bishop e3, king g6, bishop d2, king h7, bishop e3, g6, bishop d2, g7, bishop e3, promote to a knight with a check, king f8, king h8, bishop d2, e5, bishop e3, bishop e4, bishop h6, bishop h7. And here we have it. However improbable and impossible this checkmate is managed, this is what the chief arbiter was arguing, and this is the only reason why Magnus was awarded the full point. In the meantime, was this the correct ruling, and was it just for Magnus to be given a win? And this is going to explain two of the points we raised earlier. The first one is for sure more is less. Because of these two minor pieces, a demonstration is proved where a checkmate is possible. The second point comes to the very FIDE laws of chess. And if you remember what we said from the outset of this video, reading the FIDE laws of chess is imperative, not just for the sake of reading them but also being able to remember and recall them. We could simply show all the 25 pages of the FIDE laws of chess, but we could do something else in an attempt to cut corners and at the same time speed things up. If you pay attention to this part, and here it comes, do focus your reading on Article 9.6. The FIDE laws of chess clearly stipulate that the game can only be drawn when a position is reached from which a checkmate cannot occur by any possible series of legal moves. What the chief arbiter did here was to just quote the laws, and this is one way that was demonstrated to simply show it is possible to checkmate the opposing king, even if this would normally never likely to be seen in any game of chess. And this is why the FIDE laws of chess are so important. We may not agree with them, but since they are written quite clearly, further arguments to dismiss them would be pointless. This was the biggest scandal back in 2019, but how close does this come to the recent scandal between Magnus Carlsen and Hans Niemann? This has to be a topic for the future, but since Hans Niemann was scanned repeatedly and nothing was traced, isn't he innocent until proven guilty? And this is how we are going to end today's video. We sincerely hope you enjoyed this edition and do look forward to seeing you again next time. Take care and God bless.